Hello. Welcome to a podcast on the law and its impact on computing technology and business. This is Brian Gaff. I'm a senior member of the IEEE and partner at the Edwards Wildman Palmer law firm in Boston. The IEEE is presenting this podcast in conjunction with a series of articles that I co-authored on legal issues relevant to people in the computer hardware, software, networking, and service businesses. These articles are appearing in the IEEE's Computer Magazine each month in 2012. This podcast is part 8 of our series. In the last podcast, we discussed how to raise capital to start a company. In this podcast, we will discuss some aspects of doing business in China. Joining me today for this podcast is my colleague Ken Choi. Ken is a partner in the Hong Kong office of Edwards Wildman Palmer. Welcome, Ken.
Thanks, Brian.
Ken, when a company considers expanding its operations into China, there are many steps that it needs to take, from getting government approvals to setting up the appropriate business entity. Can you walk us through the process and give us estimates on how long the various steps take?
Sure. Essentially, for an international company doing business in China, having a physical presence there are essentially 3 different ways to go. They include setting up a rep office, having a joint venture entity, or having a wholly owned foreign entity. And that's commonly called a WOFE. Now, a rep office is generally the easiest way of setting up business in China. However, it is also probably the least used of the 3 types of entities that I mentioned. And the main reason for that is that a rep office has very limited scope of business as to what it can do. Essentially, what it is allowed to do is to act as a liaison, do market research, and it can do things like that is way short of conducting business or generating revenue in China. So it's relatively not used that often. But at the same time, it is probably the cheapest way and the fastest way of setting up a presence in China. Roughly, it'll probably take, I would say, about 3-4 months for setting up. A second type of entity is a joint venture entity in which the international company joins with a local Chinese company, and they form a new company, which is generally called just a JV. In a situation like that, the JV involves probably, depending on what it does, anywhere from 6 to 12 months in setting up. And it is rather extensive, but a lot of that work goes to the Chinese party rather than the international party. And a lot of it involves in getting regulatory approvals. In China, setting up a business generally requires many more governmental approvals than, say, in the U.S. And the reason is that, for instance, if you want to say set up a manufacturing facility, in addition to just applying for a business registration, you also need to do feasibility studies. You have to basically lay out a business plan for the government to approve. And in addition to that, there are different government entities that have to approve. For instance, if you need to set up the manufacturing facilities, well, you have to get certain types of permits. If you need to engage in any type of manufacturing that involves some type of chemical, that may involve approval from health authorities. And so it is fairly complex. And again, it takes 6 months to a year to set up. The third type, which has been popular for a while and then has gone down in popularity, is what we call a WOFE, a wholly foreign-owned entity in which either one or more foreign entities own that, set up a company there. And the difference between this and a JV is that most of the work, practically all the work, falls on the international entity itself rather than the local partner. And again, the process takes generally between 6 months and a year, and again, the same type of requirements, same type of approvals will be needed. So setting up a business in China compared to the West is typically much more involved and a much more elaborate process than one would expect.
How does a company begin this process? Does it typically outsource the work to consultants, or is this something that it could handle in-house?
Well, generally, it is best to work together with a local agent, and the main reason is because you want someone on the ground who is familiar with local regulatory schemes and requirements, as well as the local environment. And so our suggestion is that unless your company is very, very experienced in terms of doing business in China, it is always best to use a local agent. And in terms of the type of agents to use, it's always best to find one who is experienced in the locale in which you intend to set up business. And the other aspect is that you want to find someone who is also experienced in dealing with international companies rather than a purely local agent that does things for local clientele. And the reason is because in general, there are slightly different regulations in terms of dealing with international entities and local entities.
What's involved with setting up operations in a special administrative region, for example, Hong Kong? Are the requirements different from those you've just discussed?
Well, Hong Kong is a very different environment. We are governed here in Hong Kong by different laws. So the laws in China are not applied here. And setting up in Hong Kong is completely different. It's very simple. You can set up a limited company within a week. And many people, international companies, like to go through Hong Kong as a springboard to their Chinese operations. And the main reason for this is that, number one, Hong Kong is common law. And Hong Kong is also, English is also one of the official languages in Hong Kong. And so many international companies are very comfortable with Hong Kong. Our legal system basically derived from the English system. It's very close to the English. And so I think that many people feel more comfortable with it. And in addition to that, the Hong Kong government and the mainland Chinese government have various agreements and arrangements so that it is much easier for a Hong Kong company to set up and do business in China than, say, by a U.S. company or any other international company wanting to set up directly. And so I think that many people would prefer to go through Hong Kong. Again, setting up a company in Hong Kong is probably similar to setting up a company, in Rhode Island in the U.S. or in the U.K. It is something that's very familiar to most international companies, and in fact, in situations like that, most of the time they can set up a Hong Kong company themselves rather than through the use of a local agent.
A long-standing concern of companies doing business in China has been how to protect their intellectual property. For example, a company may want to manufacture items in China using a confidential process. Can you explain how protection of intellectual property has evolved over the last few years in China, and what kind of support a company can expect as it tries to maintain control of its proprietary materials?
Well, I think intellectual property in China I think raises many alarms for most people. But I think that, to be fair to China, certainly in the last 10, 15 years or so, the Chinese legal system has made tremendous progress in development of intellectual property. And so I think that the environment today is very, very different from that of, say, 10, 15 years ago. But nevertheless, I think the Chinese system still needs improvement, and they'll get this through experience and just time, because the laws there are pretty new. In terms of protecting intellectual property, certainly in the computer industry, a lot of it involves copyright in terms of software and other confidential information. I think the easiest way to think about what to do when you want to protect your company secrets in China is to think of it as that. To in fact use a lot of common sense. Think of your IP assets as something as akin to something that is that contains the most embarrassing personal information about yourself. Well, if that's the situation, how would you deal with that? You're not going to leave it open for everyone to see. You're going to take steps to protect it. And I think that very simply, if you think of your company's assets as that, you probably use common sense and do a lot of things that will help you protect your trade secrets. And so I think that having that frame of mind is very, very useful. At the same time, I think that there are Chinese laws in terms of IP protection. And one thing that's interesting about IP law is that regardless of which jurisdiction you're talking about, essentially they're very similar across the board, and mostly because of various treaties among different countries and jurisdiction. And so the laws themselves are very similar between China and other places. Certainly in terms of implementation, there are differences, and those are the areas that an international company has to be aware of. That implementation is very different, and part of it is because China only really has IP law within the last 25, 30 years, and so there's still developing their understanding and appreciation of it as a society. And I think as time goes on, it will become easier and better for international companies.
What about litigation? If a company has a dispute in China, how difficult are the court systems to navigate? Can a foreign company be expected to be treated reasonably?
Well, I think that yes. But one thing to keep in mind is that China is a civil law system. It is not a common law system. So in that sense, the Chinese legal system is probably much closer, say, to the German system or the Swiss system, and many of the European jurisdictions than to the U.S. or the U.K. But keeping that in mind, I think that a international company nowadays, especially in the larger cities, can expect to be treated more or less equally by the Chinese legal system, Chinese courts. Certainly in the areas of intellectual property rights. In all the major cities, there are special legal chambers that handle nothing but intellectual property rights, and judges in those chambers are pretty knowledgeable and about these issues. And so I think that in general, an international party can navigate through the system rather well. But of course, having the right legal advisors would be very useful. In this process.
Thanks, Ken, for your views on this. We hope that you found this podcast helpful in understanding some issues involving doing business in China. Stay tuned for our next installment in Computer Magazine. Until next time, this is Brian Gaff
and Ken Choi.
Feel free to contact us via email at bgaff@edwardswildman.com
or at kchoi@edwardswildman.com.
Thank you.